Hey, what's up guys? In this video we are going to be continuing along our understanding of analog. This is part 2, and analog is a synthesizer. It generates sound, and it is a subtractive synthesizer. It's an analog modeled subtractive synthesizer, and it's an instrument within Ableton Live. So just think of it as a synthesizer. So let's just do a quick little review of what a subtractive synthesizer is, right? So we have our sound generation here. I'm just going to turn it up. Sound generation, we can change pitch, octave, things like that. And then we have a filter, which will attenuate frequencies depending on the filter type that we have, and this is where the term subtractive comes from. Right? And then that goes into the amplifier, which brings it up to a volume that we can hear. Right? And things, for the most part, flow from left to right, oscillator into filter, filter into amplifier, right? So there are a number of, well, there's three sound generation sources. There's oscillator 1 right here, and then there's noise, which we didn't cover in the last video, and then there's oscillator 2. And oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, you enable it and disable it by toggling that on off. These can be, relative to each other. And you can do all sorts of stuff with that, with different shapes and whatnot. We can also turn those both off. We can go into the noise and explore the noise, which is a white noise generator, or signal generator. And it has its own built-in filter. It's called color, but what it does is it attenuates. It's a low-pass filter, and it's 6 dB per octave, I believe. Right? And right out of the box, everything is essentially sent into this one filter, right? Everything is routed into this one filter up here. So I'm going to give you a visual representation here, right? So we have oscillator 1, noise, and oscillator 2. I'm gonna write that in because it's worth kind of visualizing this. So we got osc 1, and then we have noise. No, that's an awful S. And then we have osc 2, right? Represented down here. They are both on, and they are both being fed into this filter, and everything is attenuated at once, and I'll just write that in. This is the filter, and it's filter number 1, also known as fill 01, and that is represented right here. So oscillator 1, noise, and oscillator 2 are all being fed into filter 1, and I'll just demonstrate that now. Right? All being fed into that. So I'll just draw that in. They're all pointing into that guy right there. Okay. So now we're going to get into, I guess, routing that's a little more complex, but you're gonna get it, I promise you. There's another filter down here, and what does that do? It's off. Like, why is it there? In analog, you have the ability to route the sound generators to a mixture of filter 1 and filter 2. And by default, they're only going into filter 1, but I'm going to write this out. Filter 2, right? You got filter 2 and filter 1. Right now, these sound sources are just going into filter 1. and this filter 2 is off, right? That's because each of the sound sources has a filter routing option, okay? The noise, oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 both have these routing options, right? So right now, F1, they're all going into F1. We can drag and slide down, and then you get a, I guess, a percentage of which one is going into which. So all the way up, it's filter 1, which is this filter here. And if I drag and drop this down, it's filter 2, and it's just being fed into filter 2, right? So we have the flexibility of routing oscillator 1 into either filter 1 or filter 2, or if we double click, it's 50-50. So let's just kind of take this slow here. We only have oscillator 1 activated right now, and right, it's just being, oops, just gonna redo this diagram because this can get, yeah, really confusing, especially for the newer person. So right now, the output of oscillator 1 is being fed equally between filter 1 and filter 2. And the actual volume coming out of filter 1 hasn't changed. But oscillator 1 is being fed into filter 2 as well. So we will turn that on. And I'm not hearing anything. I'm not hearing anything out of there. Because, and this is very important in terms of understanding this synth, is the amp 1 and amp 2. I'm just going to write that out. So there's amp 1, and then there's amp 2. Filter 2 and filter 1 have their own dedicated amplifier circuit, which corresponds to amp 1 and amp 2. These are linked at all times, right? So, there's no routing allowed. You can't have things going into, we can't have any funny business involving this. The output of these filters, filter 1 always goes into amp 1. Filter 2 always goes into amp 2. And that is exceptionally important to understand when you are looking at this synth here. So let's turn on amp 2 because it's not even on. So filter, like the audio from oscillator 1 is going into filter 1 and filter 2 as per my diagram here. And it's obviously going into filter 2, but amp 2 is not on. So I'm going to turn that on and give that a play. Right? And it indeed sounds weird. And the reason for that is because filter 1 and filter 2, as of right now, are running in series, right? Running in series. So there's a series kind of filtering situation going on right now. So filter 1 is actually being fed into filter 2 as well. So oscillator 1 is going into filter 1 and then going into filter 2, and then oscillator 1 is also going into filter 2, right? So we are getting, something called parallel. Like we're getting into, I'm mentioning the terms parallel and serial. It's going to become more and more clear as this video series goes on, but that's what's happening. And the reason why is because filter 1 has a routing option also. And filter 1, the output of filter 1 is going into the amplifier, right? It always is, no matter what, unless it's off or the volume's down. But it's always going out, and that's what we're hearing when it's on. But filter 1 is also being fed into filter 2. And then that's going into the amp 2. So if we take that and we take it all the way down to 0, right? Filter 1 is no longer going into filter 2. The sound will seem a little bit more to what we would expect. Right? Because right now, let's just solo this. We'll turn off amp 2, and we're just hearing amp 1. Right, there's that. We'll turn off amp 1, we'll turn on amp 2. Right, that's a little bit quiet. Let's turn that up. Right, we're getting some stuff that I'm going to ignore me doing that. We're getting some sound coming out, and this would be a parallel filtering, right? Let me just get rid of that. So there's two kinds of synthesis. Well, I guess there's two kinds of processing when we're talking about filters in in this kind of context. I really want to get into it, but I don't want to confuse you. So there's the signal, audio signal coming in. Right? And that is going in. And it can either go into we'll say a filter, and then that can go into a filter, and then that can go into the out. This right here, right? This would be serial or in series. So, serial filter, right? They're one after another in series. Okay, so another way we could go about doing that would be, the same thing, but it goes into a module that splits, and we have filter up here and filter down here, and then these are summed, right? And then you go to the out, right? So I'm actually just going to write out audio signal because I think it's important. Audio signal, right? So this would be parallel. Right here would be can't spell. It would be, parallel. So we got serial, we got parallel, right? Make sense? Hope it does. And that's what we're effectively doing when we are messing around with the routing. So when filter 1 is not going into filter 2, it's just going into the output, and the output is on, this configuration, and when it's 50-50, this oscillator is being split equally into filter 1 and filter 2, and then they're both being, output. And it becomes more apparent. Let's get a format in there. Right? We're having multiple filters going on at the same time, and that gives us the flexibility to do some interesting things. And what we can do and what we were doing before would be serial, right? So one filter going into another. So we'll go into oscillator 1 and have that set to filter 1. And then we'll have filter 1 going into filter 2 100%, right? And I'll have this one set to format. This is a popular workflow, and have the bottom one. So the signal flow right now is, what's that signal flow? Signal flow is, oscillator 1 going into filter 1, right? It's going into this, and then that's going into the amplitude there. And then this is going into filter 2, and then the output is being output right there to the amplifier 2. So what we're going to be hearing the amplifier 1 also which mitigates what we want to do. We want to do serial compression. The output of this format will still be going out. So what we need to do is just disable that. And that way, the audio flows in a way that we approve of. And it sounds like this. Right, so we have that format going on, and then we have the ability to low pass it. Right? And this just lends to some really interesting and flexible routing. And it becomes more visible, and you don't have to set these things up. If that does confuse you, what you can do is you can actually go into the volume area, and we can see some quick routing options here. So the O, the F, and the A, right? Oscillator, filter, amplifier. Right now, it says the oscillator goes in the filter. Oscillator 1 goes into filter 1, goes into amplifier 1. If I click on that, that will change, and then the amplifier will go on. If I want oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 to both go into filter 1 and then to the output, I can click on that, and the configuration will change. And if I want both oscillators to go into filter 1, and then I want filter 1 to go into filter 2, and then be output into the amplifier 2, right? I can click on that, and it'll change. And then I can do some really interesting like crossover sort of thing where they each go into both filter and they have independent amplifier output there. And you get a completely different result, right? I'll just show you. Right? So routing is important, and I hope I made that clear. And that's what the quick routing does in terms of what's going on there. So let's get into some things that sound pretty nice. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to create a new version of analog, and I'm going to go in here, just ignore what I'm doing. I'll explain what this is later. And I'm going to hit a note. I'm going to give us some volume in the amp, right? So we got just simply oscillator 1 going into filter 1, going into amp 1. Filter 1 is also going into filter 2 100%, but it's not even on, so don't even worry about it. It's not going to waste any cycles or anything. So let's get to the LFO section. And it may seem like I'm skipping over things, but I'm going to be visiting those later in the video. So this is the LFO section. This is another oscillator. Essentially, it's exactly the same as oscillator 1 when we have it set to a sine wave, right? That is a sine wave, and this LFO is also a sine wave. And we can turn the LFO on, right? And the contextual menu will illuminate, saying that, hey, you got some stuff activated, and we can select a bunch of different waves. Some of these might be familiar. We got sine, we got triangle, and we have rectangle. And I don't know why these are different. Oh no, they are different. They are the same. I always want to call it square or pulse. But anyway, let's stick to sine for now because that'll demonstrate what's going on. These are very slow modulators. And just as a quick refresher, remember when we had that auto filter in here and we had the LFO kind of moving things like this? That's what this LFO was doing, and we had the rate. That's essentially what's going on. It's the same thing, but what you kind of attach to it and what you modulate has a bit more freedom. And when we get into advanced synthesis and modulation matrices and stuff like that, You can modulate things with other things, and we haven't even begun to get into audio rate modulation and FM phase modulation. You're gonna lose your mind. So we have LFO on, and nothing's happening, right? The LFO is on, and we have a rate of 0.9 hertz. These are in how many times a second the cycle will repeat. So quick refresher of that. In this particular readout, we have this zero crossing here, and this zero crossing here, and then this zero crossing here. This is the top half of a thing called a duty cycle. I guess that would be, the positive. This one is the negative, right? And this range right here, from here to here, is the duty cycle, and then it repeats, right? It repeats at a rate that we set. In this case, what we're playing, it kind of is changed based on what key we're pressing. Right. Now it's doubled down, and it creates a tone that is distinguishable from other notes, right? Because the duty cycle got shorter. This also has a duty cycle, but is way slower. It's like every second. That's that's below the threshold of human hearing, right? We can maybe hear 30 hertz. Below, we're just kind of feeling it. Speakers in clubs don't even produce 1 hertz frequencies. It's very slow. And what does it do? Well, we have the ability to have this affect other signals. And the first one we're going to use to explain it would be the pitch in the oscillator. Right? So it's very uniform. It's a sine. It's very pleasing to look at. Over here in the context menu of the oscillator, right, I'm looking at this area. I've selected that area, and I'm going to be looking at the pitch mod. It's a modification or modulation, whatever you want to call it. There's an LFO 1 right here, LFO.1. What does that do? Well, that is this right here. And if you notice, I turned it off and it grayed out in this area right here. I can turn it on again. What this is the depth that this LFO will affect the pitch. I'll just let you kind of hear what that does as I increase it. Right? It's affecting it. And we can move up and down the intensity there, and I'll increase the window size. Right? Right? Those are getting, closer together, and farther apart. So it's affecting the pitch of it. And that would be controlling the LFO amount. Right? And what I can do is I can get that way up there to point, or to 1, because we're dealing with floating point numbers. Right? We can go really crazy. That's a really crazy sweep. And that's the depth. And we can go -1, right? But it's a unipolar LFO. So anyway, the rate can be adjusted. The speed of this can be adjusted. Let's set this to something like this. So every second we're, the duty set, we're sweeping in pitch. We can increase this. To 17 hertz. So 17 times a second that thing is vibrating, and it's what this is vibrato. Right? We can get really extreme where it's like a slow thing, and then the sine wave just gets compressed. That duty cycle gets compressed very fast. And that happens 17 times a second, which is pretty insane. And that's what LFOs do. You don't actually hear them, but you hear the effects depending on what you plug them into. So I'll double click to make that stay there. I'm going to highlight a couple more areas. I'm going to select a square wave or a rectangular wave, right? And remember how we could, I'm going to highlight it, this one right here. This is a classic effect. I'm just going to highlight the areas that we are working with here. Remember I said that what's really cool about square waves, you could adjust the pulse width to like really small, right? We can actually modulate that with that LFO. Let me just make that a little bit slower. And go back over here. Let's modulate that. Right? Now we're getting pulse width modulation, or PWM. And this is just elementary, basic synth stuff. We're creating changes over time to a sound, adding complexity. We can increase the rate too. Right, and we can get some bananas sounds that way. And that's just the beauty of the LFOs and how they work. We can only modulate things in the oscillator 1, filter 1, and amp 1 with LFO 1, and oscillator 2, filter 2, and amplitude 2, amplifier 2 with LFO 2. So these, just always think about this as fundamentally two synths in one, but then you have the ability to route around in there. So that is the basis of the LFO in terms of how it affects pitch. And let's move on to the actually, let's stick around here for a while, or a quick second. Let me look at that. All right, let me turn that down. What we have here, and this actually becomes more apparent with the saw wave. So the LFO has been grayed out because there's no pulse width modifications that you can do to saw waves, at least in the analog realm. Each oscillator has the ability to have another oscillator within it. And this oscillator is either a sub-oscillator, or the phase of the oscillator can actually be shifted and cause something called sync. And this is a classic analog sound. So right now it's in sub mode, and I'll highlight this right here. This is what we're working with. A sub is an oscillator tied to an oscillator that you actually hear, and it's a division below, usually an octave below or two octaves below. I'll just increase the level. Right, it creates another saw below it, so you get a richer harmonic there. It's typical. It's typical that you would have a sub oscillator below another oscillator, because if you're up high in the higher registers, right, you might be like, I want it to fill up the spectrum a tiny bit more. We can do that by increasing the level there, and it actually becomes more apparent with the spectrum here. Right, you notice how there's all of these harmonics here, and as we increase the level, we'll get more. Right, so it's effect. You're getting a free oscillator. It just has to be, it has to be the oscillator that's already there. It's just a division below, and that's pretty cool. So I want to talk about phase briefly. We're going to be getting into phase a little bit more, but in order to understand the next mode, which is called sync, I have to express what phase is. Let me just get that going on. So, we have let's just say that this is the duty cycle, right? Beginning and end. And at any point along the horizontal line, at any point along here, that would be called the phase of kind of what it is, like where it is. So this would be, it's represented in actually, no, I'm going to make this bigger because I think it's worth I do that. Oops. Okay, we have duty cycle, the 0 crossing here, and then the 0 crossing here. And then this whole area, is the duty cycle. And depending on where it sits on here, if you wanted to like give a name to like where this is, it's in degrees, right? So right here, this would be, 0 degrees. And then this one right here would be 180 degrees. And then here, right, wouldn't be 0, it'd be 360. Right? So if you have a bunch of these waveforms going on and they're all stacked up and you want to offset one, you say, I want you to offset this by, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 degrees. That's the relationship between that. And you can think of phase as, the linearity between 0 and 360. Right? So, at any point, this can be expressed as an angle and as just a way to understand it, right? So we start at 0 and then we end at 360. And then right after that, we go back to 0 and then we go to 360. 0, 360, right? And 180 is significant because, that's a way to... no, I'm not going to do that right now. My apologies. So if we were to affect and apply sync to this waveform within this duty cycle, it would look something like this. Oh, and it did it kind of backwards. I got the readout wrong. Right, so I'm actually going to display that a little bit better now. Right, so what is happening is I'm supposing, well, no, I'm not supposing. I'm actually, oh my goodness, what am I doing? It's a lot more apparent with a sine wave. This'll be a lot better. Okay, so we have the sine wave here. And same thing applies, we have the duty cycle. But what if at, say, 270 degrees, it just restarted back at 0? That's what the sync mode does. And I'll show you that right now. When it does something weird. Oh, you bastard. Okay, let me try this. Oh, because it doesn't have sync. How lame. Let's try this one. No. Okay, saw is the best example here. Okay, so what's happening with sync and the ratio of sync is the duty cycle begins here, and then it's actually supposed to end there, right? This would be actually the 0 degrees, and then this would be the 360, but it would restart back at 0 at around 270, right? And I'm going to demonstrate that. So I'll just set it back to what it was. The heck's going on here? I'm not explaining this very well. All right, so it's essentially restarting. It's restarting the phase as it's playing, and it's called sync. So it's supposed to, this is supposed to continue along to around here and then restart, but it actually restarts here, and then it's windowed so that it restarts again here. It will, yeah, it'll become more clear in a synth that makes it seem a little bit more visual. But what this does is this again adds complexity to that, because in electronics you're always you know, in some aspects you're manipulating phase, and you have control over it, and that's a more advanced topic when we're talking about something called a phaser, which is essentially a value between 0 and 1, which tells you where on the degree scale that it is. And I really want to demonstrate this, but you can kind of tell and wrap your head around what it's doing. It's copying itself and then repeating. So if you have an extreme value, you get these interesting harmonics that way. Right? So that would be the sync mode and sub. So let's move on to filter 2 for now. Like, this is super complicated, but the same thing still applies. So if I have a filter here, I can have the LFO, right, mapped to this filter right here, right, the frequency mod. And then we're getting more into, I guess, I wouldn't call it complicated territory, but I want to explain this correctly. We have two LFO slots here. I'm going to call them slots. Things that the LFO1 can modulate within the filter module, right? It could be frequency or resonance. Let's do frequency. Right, so we got some wibbly wobbly stuff, and then resonance as well. Right, so we got some really cool movement there, and that's done with the LFO. That's essentially what we were doing with the auto filter before in a previous video. Right, and that's why there are, values below, so the modulation will be kind of inverse. So instead of going up in the sine wave and it being affected, it's reversed, so it's going down. So as the filter goes up, the resonance goes down in this case. Oops. And then we can have it go up. Right, and that'll become more clear in the incoming videos as I demonstrate that some more. The rest of this I'm not going to get into quite yet. I also, no, you know what I'll point out is the key. So as you move up and down the keyboard, if you turn on something called key or key tracking, the filter will actually open up automatically depending on what note you're pressing. Right, and let's look at the spectrum for this. We just do that. And I can just turn off LFO1. Right, the cutoff point remains the same. If I engage key tracking to a maximum value, right, it will open up depending on what key I'm pressing. I think it's 1. Right? That cutoff point is it's relevant to the note that we're pressing. It becomes more apparent with noise. So you can make noise more tonal as you move up and down the keyboard. Right? And that is a way to you know, have a filter seem more natural depending on what you're feeding into it. Sorry, I have to wipe my nose. That was disgusting. I apologize. And that's all I'm going to show you about the filter right now. So we're going to go into, I'm going to actually get a new version of analog in there. Ignore what I'm doing because I'm going to be explaining something here. So this is a saw wave. Turn up the level. I'm going to look at it over a longer period of time. And, you know, when I press a note, it goes on and it stays on continuously. And then when I release a note, it goes off. And, you know, that is dictated by something called a gate. And, well, in the analog world, it's called a gate. But in MIDI, when I hit a note here, that would be the note on. And then over here would be the note off. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate something called envelopes, and I'm going to apply it to the amplifier section. And this is going to be able to, this is going to be able to be translated to different places as we go. So I'm going to open up the MIDI editor here, and I'm just going to put some stuff in. And I might have to go down. And I'll just do that. Right, so that's following along, that's what it looks like. Right, simple on, simple off. And what is happening is, you know, again, note on, note off, right? And what we're going to be changing is the profile of that. We're going to be using the amplifier and an envelope. And I'm not going to keep on repeating myself. So let me get some lines here. So we have this line here. Actually, no. Get that line there. This is time, right? And time, you know, moves in the direction. Always moves this way. This is time. Okay, so we have this right here. What is this? This is note on, right? This is a MIDI signal. And then over here we have, this would be note off. Okay, so synth receives a signal of note on. Let's just leave out the idea that it receives the pitch and velocity. Let's just focus on note on for now. That needs to be fed into the amplifier section, and it says, okay, note on. You're going to go up to full power, right? Because that's essentially what it's doing, right? Going from 0 to full power. I'm just going to move this over here. Right, 0 to full power, right? If we say, I want there to be a slower attack, so, you know, let's just say, well, yeah, actually we'll draw another line here. And this line will represent the full power of the signal. All right. This would be, I guess, we'll say, you know, full amplitude, just for the sake of argument. So right now, with the attack, where it's at right now, the attack is very fast. It's 5 milliseconds. So from note on to full power, it's it's essentially instantaneous, right? It just goes up, right? It's on. If we were to slow that down, we would, we'll increase that time in terms of milliseconds. It will, be slower, right? It's a slower attack time for that to reach full power, right? So it's slower, and it's in a shape, but it does that, right? So it takes a little while to get up to full power. That is the attack, right? So next up, let's look at the decay. Actually, nope. Let's look at the release. So the release, when we receive note off, right, which is right here, right? This is note off, right? This is a MIDI note, and I'll just display that here. So MIDI notes here, da 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 da, and I will name that. This would be MIDI note. Note on, note off. So when it's at full power, the release, when it's really fast, the note will it'll just end, right? But if we increase the release, it will, essentially just kind of curve off like that. And I'll demonstrate that. I'll show you. It actually does do that. So I'll go to the release here, right? Releases that, and I'll just increase that. Right? I just want to make sure we see all that. So there's the attack here, and then the release there. Okay, so here's where it gets kind of intense, I suppose. So the full power is dictated, and the full power can actually be adjusted by the sustain here. And you'll look at the sustain value as we bring it down. It will, move the full power down, right? So check this out. And it's more obvious when we take the attack and make that really fast, right? Right? So it's the kind of, the decay is the spike that would occur the top here, and then the full power would be the sustain. And the sustain time is essentially, as long as the note is pressed, it will be at that value, and that's the full power. I'm going to demonstrate it in this graph because I think it's a lot more powerful to do this that way. And I'm just going to do cycles. Okay, so I'm going to get some sort of curve here. Boom, and now I'm going to zoom in because I have that ability. So yeah, it used to be a block of, sound. It used to be a square, but now this is, affected by the amplifier envelope. And that's what we're effectively doing right here. So there's that, and then there's that, and then there's that. So that right there, and then that will be right there. Okay, so these lines mean something. The first one, this one right here, would be note on. And, that should be very apparent, this first line. But the area in here, this is the attack. I'll write that down. This is the attack. And then this right here is the decay. And I'll just decay. And each of these has a rate. And then this whole area is the sustain. or max power, right? I guess not max power, but you know, where it kind of settles to. It's something that I called max power, but whatever. It's kind of where it levels off. And then this would be the release. And what this is called an ADSR. Okay, let's look at another version of an ADSR. You'll notice that it's curved, right? And if we know anything about anything that we're doing right now, we have, you know, what am I even talking about? We have curved and then we have linear, so logarithmic and linear. If we set this to linear, these won't be curved anymore, as we can see down here. If we set it to linear, we get a somewhat seemingly different result. And I want to see everything here. The heck? Come on, dude. Did I break it? Okay. Not triggering. I close it and open it. Don't do this to me now. No. Come on, dude. All right, I had to just close it and open it again. I got all confused there. But what we can do is we can look at things in a more linear way. And what we'll notice is that the decay can actually make something seem a bit more snappy. Right? So with a fast attack, right, in terms of milliseconds, if this attack is really short, the actual, you know, if it opens, will kind of squarify at the beginning. I mentioned that in a previous video, but this is a good way to shape what's going on. And the usefulness of this is that it allows you to, you know, you can shape noise in terms of its amplitude, make like percussive sounds. Right? And you can do some stuff with resonance as well. And then you can key track the filter. Like that. Right, just for the sake of example. And that is for the amplifier. This can also, envelopes can apply to a number of different things. I'm going to show you that right now. Right, we have a filter here. This filter also has an envelope. And what we can do is we can look at the spectrum and we can see the filter opening and closing over time according to this filter. So the filter depth is dictated by this envelope amount, which is for the frequency. So this can get a little confusing, but the area that I'm highlighting right now are all the things that can affect the frequency, right? We've already done the LFO. The key tracking affects the cutoff depending on what key we're pressing. And the envelope is the amount that the dedicated envelope will affect it. So right now it's exponential. And what we can do if we set this down here, right, it will kind of open and then open really quickly and then close. And you get a really cool result. And I'll bring this down, right? So right now, you know, the filter is at 424. But as I increase the envelope, right, the filter is essentially, the envelope is telling the filter to open and then decay and then sustain at 0, or, you know, the value that it once was. So right here would be, you know, this would be 424, and then it would go up to a value right here dictated by the envelope depth, and then it would fade back down to 424. Right, so you can get some really cool stuff there. And the slope is significant depending on what you would like to achieve. Analog circuitry, it's called slew rates, I imagine. Analog circuit, it doesn't act linearly. It doesn't go from one point to one point. Digital stuff does. But sometimes linear stuff is desirable. So if I select linear for this, the filter will go up, wow, wow, as I'm holding a note. I can adjust that, right? So me moving these around is essentially adjusting the Adsr in this right here. So I can adjust things like so. I can change the decay and the release time. But that release time is not going to really do much of anything because it's related to the amp release time, which gets cut off right away. Right, but if I had that set, if I had the release set like so, and I let the amplifier, in terms of its audio, ring out a little bit, right, it would behave that way, and that would be an envelope affecting the frequency. So all sorts of interesting things you can do. You can also have the envelope affecting the resonance. You can do all sorts of stuff with that. And that's all well and neat. And that's the filter envelope. Classic analog synths have their own dedicated filter envelope because its effect was so good and sounded great, and it just worked for a lot of designs. So it used to be something you'd patch in, but then you wouldn't use a filter without an envelope. Just attach an envelope to it, and they would be represented with Adsr. So moving on, there's some things that I'm skipping over, but I'll be back. Let's go into this section. We already have covered everything here in terms of, the key tracking for the envelope works similarly to the filter key tracking, right? So as we move up the keyboard, we might want the volume to go down because we have the amplitude selected. That might be an effect we're looking for. We can do all sorts of stuff with the, that was actually pan. This is the level, right? The level modification, right? So the level mod here and the pan mod are affecting these two values here. So level and then pan, right? So these are stereo paths, right? And this allows you to, have a wider sound, which is going to be the next thing I'm going to get into. This amplifier, we can pan it. And do some cool stuff. Let's actually double click that. And set that back to normal. We've covered a lot of things with the LFO. I want to get into some retrig stuff. So I'm going to enable LFO 1 and go into the oscillator tab here. And I want LFO 1 to modulate the pitch. I want it fast too. I want it to be a little bit more obvious. Right. So when I hit a note, the LFO will occur almost immediately. And that's all well and good. But every time I hit a note, right, it just starts at a continuous point. It actually does not start at the phase of 0 degrees. This is something that's called free running. It's running all the time. So every time I hit a note, it's just continuing along wherever it lands. But if I were to select retrig and select, or hit a note, I should say, right? It's always starting at the start of this sample. Not the sample, the start of this waveform's duty cycle. So the duty cycle is right here. And if we remember, I want to hammer this home because we're going to get into phase a little bit more. Like this is 0 and this is 360, right? The duty cycle is in between these 2 points, right? You'll notice that the offset is at 0. So what does that mean? Well, that's saying retrigger every time I hit a new note and set the phase to 0. Reset the phase to 0 every time I hit a new note, and that's what it's doing. So if I were to do some increments at that, oh, we actually see it. Nice. I can actually change the phase so that it would start way up here. Right? And this becomes more apparent with something like a triangle, right? I'm going to double click on that to reset it. Still the same duty cycle. I can actually change it, right? Or I can change it to there, right? That's 180. That's 180 degrees, right? Right? And right here in between 0 and 360 is 180 right there, right? So that's being offset, and I can do all sorts of things. And I can go all the way to 360, and I can change the phase of where it starts. So when you have oscillators that are, multiple oscillators that are synced to each other, and they're, retrigged, you want to have the phase and have control over the phase, because then you can do some really interesting things. Right, so right now it's starting at the lowest point, goes up, high, and then down. Every time I hit a note. But if I take that off, it's just a random thing there. And I can change the width to a ramp up. A ramp down, a saw wave. I can change the width to a ramp up. And this gives me a really good representation of what the sync is doing again, right? So I have it set to that, right? 0 to 360 for this saw wave, right? Let's pretend this is a sync there. I can increase the rate, and then, it will kind of restart, and it'll change the phase representation of what's going on. That's essentially what it's doing. Right, and we can do all sorts of fun things with that. There's a bunch of other really cool LFO shapes that are relevant to interesting music creation. So I have a retrigger off, and the offset is 0. And I'm going to set this, double click the rate back to triangle. So triangle as an LFO source is really awesome because it's a linear +1 to -1, right? It's a straight line. A sine is more of a kind of a curved, right? So it sticks around this area, and things are more kind of curved. It's more of like an average sort of thing. And the rectangle, we know what that does. It's just an abrupt off and on. We can imagine, right, when we're dealing with pitch. Right? Pretty simple to understand that. And we can adjust the width as well. Right? We can even automate that if we want to get crazy. There's noise, and this isn't really noise that you would think of. It's a little bit different. It is noise, but it will... Actually, let me just... Stop it. What are you doing, oscilloscope? 10 cycles, I need to go time. All right, so this is a sine wave. This is a random. And this is noise, and this doesn't look like noise at all. Well, what it is doing is it's taking noise and then sampling, what that point is every however many seconds. And I would like to be able to make a grid, but let's say, let me just get some lines here. So yeah, we'll get, let's just pretend like these are equal kind of spaces apart. And this is the grid in terms of let's call it an arbitrary time measurement. So what this noise is doing, it's actually called sample and hold. What it's doing is it's kind of sensing what the value was or is in this area here. So, let's say this is the value that it finds, it measures, and then let's say this is the value it measures for the next one, and then this is the next value, and then this is the next value, this is the next one, and then let's say this is the next one. What it will do is it will just sample that and then hold it until the next sample needs to be taken, and then it will hold that, and then it will hold this one, and then it will hold this one, and then this one, and then we get the stair steppiness, which is this right here. And it's taken noise, but it's made it more usable for modulation. And if it's not that clear, I will make it clear. It is essentially turning the wave into a steppy bit, and it's using noise as a source to create this steppy bit. So it is noise, but it's making it useful for the things that we want to achieve. So let's give it a listen of what that sounds like. Oscillator 1, pitch, LFO 1, and the LFO 1 is this stair steppy bit. Right, it's doing some stuff. And that is essentially sample and hold, and that is what R2D2 sounds like, and how R2D2 got the sound. This is from the ARP 2600. And it's random, so offset and all that stuff won't really do much of anything. Okay, so you have these points here. So let's say that you have your sample and hold thing going on, and it looks like this, right? And it goes on, and it looks pretty cool. And that's just a small part of that. And let's say if you wanted, instead of because this is the point that it dictated, and then no, actually, I mean, no. Okay, so say you had the points here that it sampled from the white noise. Instead of like doing a sample and hold thing, right? And it just kind of, does that and follows along. What it's doing is it's, you want it to kind of flow between points like so. You don't want it to actually hold, but you do want it to flow between points in a linear way. Well, there's a different kind of white noise, noise modulator that does that. That's noise too. And that's what this is. And this is more of a kind of a movie aroundy kind of LFO. Right? And it's, another flavor. And when these are really low and, the depth is not as intense, you get this interesting movement, and it mimics pitch tracking not working that well. So one or two things I want to, well, two things I want to look at as we wrap up the LFO section and what it does. And again, we're using pitch here. I have the sine wave here, which is vibrato. Right? What if, I'm going to go over here, what if I wanted that to kind of be delayed a little bit before it actually started? Well, we can do that with the delay, right? And that will give us an interesting effect. And we have an attack, which will slowly ramp up the modulation amount. So that it's not as like abrupt. We can have, one at 417 milliseconds, or maybe even a little bit longer. Right, so it takes a while to get up to full power. We can mix that with the delay, and these two together make a lot of sense. Right, so we're getting movement and expression through the synth with just an LFO on the vibrato. And I've been using the LFO on the pitch here, and that was already built in to the synth itself, just because it's so used that they wanted to free up these LFOs to modulate other things. And it's actually in this main volume section here. And we can increase the amount and the rate. Right, with the vibrato, same thing, which is pretty nice. Let's get into more of the voicing. So this is the window that we look at when we're looking at the volume. When I click on the volume section of this device, there's the routing, which we looked at, which can give us quick routing, which allows us to not have to set up ratios and move the filters around and stuff like that. There's also a bunch of options around here, and one of them we were already kind of looking at, and I need that to be a tiny bit smaller. This is the vibrato section, right? Because it's such an important effect that it just needs to be on its own separate thing. You don't want it to take up an LFO. So click on vibrato to enable it, and we can see it here. So same controls, delay and attack. You can increase that even more. Right, and the delay as well. We can do all sorts of fun stuff with that. And the error, and it will the vibrato rate will, what does it say? It'll say it'll deviate, and it apparently has no effect if vibrato is not enabled. But yeah, this will give it some error in the vibrato. Which is pretty interesting. And then this gives us the ability to have the mod wheel affect the vibrato. So the mod wheel is next to the pitch bend on the left of like almost every single keyboard, electronic keyboard. It is, well, the pitch is there to, give you some pitch bend for expression, which we'll get into in a later video. We're going to be automating that with MIDI. But then the one next to it is the mod wheel. And the mod wheel, they had it because you could kind of map it to anything. It's just a value slider, and you can apply it to anything. And a lot of the times, it's mapped to the vibrato. So you can have a value or have a control that would control the amount. So this is how that works. You'd have that set to 100, and then the mod wheel would essentially do this. We want that up a little bit more. Right, so you can do some like, you know, Prince vibrato-y stuff with that. So this is an important control, and that's why it is there. Next up is the keyboard. So what does this mean? A lot of things I'm going to be getting into. What this will do is a lot of it is a global transpose. So if I, right, and that is for oscillator 1, 2, and noise and all that fun stuff. Semitone as well. Detune, we can actually detune this slightly. And what that will do, if we have a bunch of these stacked up, it'll give us more of an analog feel, because these analog pieces of equipment, they would, if they weren't tuned, they'd be slightly off, and that would, you know, contribute to the sound. Voices, okay. So what is a voice? It's not how many notes you can press down. So a voice is the synth's ability to play more than one note. Or, no, sorry. I'm going to show you what one voice is. So this is mono, or one, right? We can only play one note at a time. Right, I try to play two notes. It doesn't. It won't let me play two notes at once. A voice can be an oscillator noise and oscillator 2. Right? And I'll just kind of beef those around. Right, and I want that envelope to affect that, just so we can listen to something somewhat neat. Okay, so this would be mono. It will include oscillator 1, noise, and oscillator 2. Okay, we set this to 2. We have the ability to play two notes at once. Two voices at once, and that would allow us to have, you know, each note that we play, which would be 2, will have its own oscillator signal sources, its own filters, and its own amplitude or amplifier. So what does that mean? Well, you know, a voice, I think, should be very rigidly defined. If you have a synth when you can play a bunch of keys, but they're all going through the same filter, that's just, you know, one voice. Even though you have control over even though you have more than one kind of oscillator, a voice is something that has a separate chain. If you have control over the sound generators in terms of, you know, more than one key at once, that's something called a paraphonic synth. You know, and this is, you know, true two voices, right? I can hold a note, I can press and hold a note, and then play another one, and the other note will continue to play, and the next one will have its own filter. You can hear it. Right? Each one has its own filter, and it has the ability to ring out. So when you have a limited amount of voices, other than, you know, it really depends on what you're doing. Let's say we have an amplifier and it has a long release. And, you know, if we're in two voices and we're just playing one note at a time, it will allow that first note to ring out. But if we want to initiate another voice, it will do something called voice stealing. That note, the decay of it, I'll show you what it is. Can I zoom out? I want to show, this is really important, right? So I stopped playing the note here, and all of this was allowed to ring out. If at any point, right, I wanted to play another voice, even right around here, this would just get cut off and it would initiate the new voice, right? Voice stealing, very important. So let's move on and get, more voices, right? We have 4 voices here. We can play 4 notes at the same time, each one with its own full signal path, sound source, filter, and amplifier. And its own LFO, right? And all these things will be independent of each other, like each voice is treated as such. Let's get back to mono for now, because what I'm going to show next, I don't want to confuse anyone. The pitch bend range, like I said, the mod wheel on a keyboard, next to it is a pitch. This will adjust the range. I can't demonstrate that right now, but this will allow us to adjust the intensity, the range right now. So the range right now is when the pitch bend wheel is all the way up, it's plus 12, all the way down, negative 12. And the stretch, what does this do? Oh yeah, this is really cool. So as we move up the keyboard, as we go up, as we move up, the pitch tracking, the pitch tracking, which is what analog synthesizers do, it will kind of become sharper, right? Because there's a general fall off where the pitch tracking becomes unstable, and that's when we get up to the higher frequencies. That's a little bit advanced for this, but just understand that there's a lot that goes into analog synths and emulating, and it's and what the sound is getting. This error percentage here, it adjusts the amount of random tuning error. So I'm pressing the same note. You can hear it kind of, deviating. And that's kind of similar to that LFO that look like this, right? It's just completely random. That's what it's doing. And this makes it sound like it's a broken synth that needs to be repaired. But it's a cool sound, and it offers some unpredictability. And this priority mode delves into note stealing, and it dictates, when you're playing, say, chords and you have limited voices, we can emulate the limitations of synths from back in the day by prioritizing the higher notes, so the lower notes get cut off first. Or we can prioritize the low, so the higher ones get cut off first. So if we want, the low end bass to be prioritized, we don't want the low end release of those notes to be cut off. Just get rid of the high ones. And then there's last, which would be, the most recent notes get priority. Last is kind of the default, just in terms of classic synths. Modern synths are very smart. They know which ones to prioritize. And why would you want to set up this limitation? Well, it makes the sound more interesting. And it, like a bunch of these little things accumulating, like say with the stretch and the error and the priority, and you're playing something or something's playing, it really adds to the vibe of the track, right? So it's really deep. You can do all sorts of things. Next up is the Unison. So think about Unison as taking this synth and then doubling it. So when we have Unison selected over here, we have the ability to kind of stack it and then pan it left and right. And what this is doing is is essentially double tracking. I think this is splitting the output into multiples. You got to hear it. Right. So there's two voices of Unison, right? So don't get the synth voices and the Unison voices mixed up. Right now it's mono, and it's absolutely mono in every single way. But on the output, just imagine it on the output after all this fun stuff. In the last point, the synth is then, there's a copy of it, and then that is set in the left and right field, stereo field. And then you have this ability to detune them from each other. Right, so you get a wider sound. Right, you can have like multiples of 2, right? So right now it'd be 2 Unison voices, one on the left, one on the right. Right now it's 4 Unison voices, 2 on the left, 2 on the right. And when we get into advanced Unison, there'll be a 1 in the center, 2 on the right, 2 on the left. And the way they detune is very important as well. But we'll get into that, and it'll look more visual in further videos. Right. What it's doing is it's essentially just beefing up the sound. And I'll give it sub. Right, let's listen to that. It's easy to overdo, let's just do 2. Right, and that would be the Unison, and we'll just disable that. The next one up is glide. So how it works in mono synths is you'll be playing a note, right, and that would be sent to the sound generation. And I'll just highlight this next one. These are the last 2 sections. We play a note, and you already heard it, right? So play a note, and then we'll move up, and it will take a while to get to that point. They're called VCOs. These VCOs aren't as instantaneous as they should be, so things kind of glide around. Right? And the time will dictate how long it takes to get from one note to the other. Right? And it's just a really cool sound, and that is called glide or gli. Right? And you can get some old school electro stuff going on when you do that. Legato it's essentially how synth manufacturers fixed that issue. They made these VCOs far more reactive, but when you would go and you would hold one note, keep it held, and then press another note, it would prioritize the latest note, but then you would get the glide that way, and it would only happen that way, and that is legato. Right, so I'll hit a note and press another one. I'll hold the note. Right? So you can get glide sometimes, but not all of the time. And I'll actually demonstrate that. I think it's worth demonstrating. So oh, son. Okay. So yeah, there's that right there. We just play that. Right? So that's legatoing, but if we take that off, right, we can have some gliding and some not. Right, so we have to kind of shorten that. right? So we'll do that right there. Why not? Actually, let's zoom in and then, right? So these aren't gliding, but these two notes are, and that gives you another opportunity to have, more interesting expression in there. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Hopefully it wasn't too long-winded. We're going to be picking up the pace in the next video in the series. So I hope you enjoyed that. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.